Somewhere along the Normandy coast in the late summer of 1066, hundreds of ships sat perfectly still. Their masts cut the skyline above the mouth of the river Dives, their hulls packed with men, provisions, armour, wine and horses. The horses alone numbered close to 2,000, the men numbered over 7,000, and none of them were going anywhere, because the wind was wrong. That image, an entire invasion frozen in place by weather, is not how most people remember 1066. Most people remember Hastings, the arrow, the hill, the shield wall breaking, Harold falling, William winning. It is one of the most recognisable battles in European history, and it has absorbed almost all the attention that year has ever received. But before any of that happened, William of Normandy had to do something that no one had done to England in a generation. He had to cross the Channel, not with a raiding party, not with a handful of ships, with an army, with cavalry horses, with enough food and equipment to sustain a military campaign on foreign soil from the moment he landed. That is what this video is about. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. The crossing of the Channel in September 1066 was a naval operation of extraordinary complexity, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms, not just as the prelude to a famous land battle, but as a feat of medieval logistics, seamanship, and nerve that very nearly failed before it began. The fleet that assembled at Dives-sur-Mer around the 12th of August was, by the count of a ship list likely compiled at the monastery of Fécamp, some 777 vessels strong. 14 Norman lords had contributed ships. The fleet carried soldiers, archers, and knights. It carried horses that would need to survive an open water crossing with no stable beneath them and no guarantee of a calm sea. It carried everything William needed to become a king, or to drown trying, and then it waited. For nearly a month, it waited. The Norman ships were clinker-built, Viking-derived longships, single-mast, oar-ports, shallow draft, and almost entirely dependent on the right wind to make a direct channel crossing. Without a steady southwesterly breeze, they were essentially pinned to the harbour mouth. Too many ships, too many men, too many restless horses, and nothing to do but watch the sky and hope the wind shifted. When the weather did finally change, it did not change in William's favour. A sudden September storm, the kind the Channel produces without warning or apology, struck the assembled fleet and drove the slower transport ships eastward along the coast. By the time the fleet regrouped at Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, the numbers had dropped. Where there had been 777 vessels, now there were closer to 696, roughly 80 ships gone, and with them an unknown number of men. Contemporary chroniclers recorded that William ordered the dead buried quietly, out of sight, to keep the mood of the surviving army from breaking entirely. That detail, the hidden dead, the deliberate silence around disaster, tells you something about what kind of operation this was. It was not just a military crossing, it was a political and psychological performance that had to look unstoppable even when it was visibly bleeding. What we'll work through in this video is how all of it actually functioned. We will look at the ships themselves, what we know and what we are still guessing about their design and capabilities. We will look at the horse transport problem specifically, because moving 2,000 warhorses across open water is not a trivial challenge, and the solution the Normans used is both fascinating and barely documented. We will look at how William read the tides and the sky at Saint-Valery, and what finally gave him the window he needed for the crossing. We will look at the night sail itself, tense, dark, dependent on timing, and what the landing at Pevensey actually required from the fleet. We will also look at the bayeux tapestry, specifically panel 39, which is the only contemporary visual record we have of the Norman fleet in preparation. It shows ships, it shows horses, it shows sailors apparently leaping from the vessels as they approach shore. It is vivid, it is strange in places, and historians are still extracting meaning from it nearly 1,000 years later, and we will look at what archaeology has and has not found. No confirmed wreck from the Conquest fleet has ever been located. The Channel has kept its secrets well. We will talk about why that is, what the absence of physical evidence means for how we reconstruct the crossing, and what a handful of unrelated 11th century wrecks found in the Thames can tell us about ships from this period. Throughout all of this, there is a genuine mystery at the heart of the story. The chroniclers disagree on numbers. The meteorological record is thin. The single most detailed account of the September storm comes from one source, and scholars have been arguing about its reliability for decades. What we are really doing, when we study the Norman crossing, is working with fragments, a ship list from a monastery, an embroidered linen panel, a few lines in a Latin chronicle, and the physics of channel weather, and trying to reconstruct something that was enormous, dangerous, and deliberately obscured even at the time. The Battle of Hastings settled who would rule England, but the crossing of the Channel determined whether there would be a battle at all. 7,000 men and 2,000 horses sitting in the mouth of a Norman river, waiting for the wind to change. Let's find out what happened when it did. To understand why William had to cross the water at all, you need to go back to the first week of January 1066. Edward the Confessor, King of England, died on the 5th of that month, childless, and leaving behind a throne that at least 3 men believed was rightfully theirs. Within a day, some accounts say within hours, the Witenagemot, England's Council of Great Lords, had named Harold Godwinson as king. He was crowned on the 6th of January, almost certainly in the newly consecrated Westminster Abbey, before Edward was even coaled in the ground. The speed of it was deliberate. Harold's supporters knew that hesitation would invite challenge, and challenge was already coming. From across the water in Normandy, William received the news with fury. His claim rested on 2 pillars. First, that Edward, his distant cousin, had promised him the English throne years earlier. Second, and more damaging to Harold personally, that Harold himself had sworn an oath in 1064 to support that claim. The exact circumstances of the oath are disputed, and the sources that describe it were written by Normans with an obvious interest in its binding force. But the political reality was clear. William believed he had been robbed, and he had the temperament, the resources, and the ambition to do something about it. The problem was geography. Normandy and England are separated by the English Channel, and the Channel, for all its apparent narrowness, is not a simple obstacle. At the Strait of Dover, the crossing is only about 21 miles wide, but that narrow corridor is dominated by powerful semi-diurnal tides, meaning the water rises and falls twice each day, generating strong currents that shift direction with brutal regularity. Further west, where William was assembling his fleet at Dives-sur-Mer on the Normandy coast, the crossing to the Sussex shore is longer, the tidal streams more complex, and the exposure to Atlantic weather far greater. The Channel does not punish carelessness occasionally. It punishes it consistently. For Harold, this geography was his first line of defence. England had not been successfully invaded since 1016. The sea was not an ally exactly, but it was a filter, one that had stopped many would-be conquerors simply through the cost and complexity of crossing it in force. A raid was one thing, an army was another matter entirely. To bring over the kind of force that could challenge an entrenched English king required ships by the hundreds, a sheltered embarkation point, the right wind, and an understanding of tides precise enough to time a landing on an unfamiliar shore without grounding your fleet in the shallows. William chose Dives-sur-Mer as his assembly point for a reason. The harbour offered shelter, and the prevailing winds in that region during summer and early autumn tend to blow from the southwest, which was exactly what a fleet of clinker-built sail-dependent vessels needed to make the crossing. Pevensey Bay, the intended landing ground on the Sussex coast, lay almost directly across on a favourable line, a shallow shingle-fringed bay that had served as landing point since Roman times, and where the tidal window could, in theory, be read and predicted. Between the two, roughly 60 miles of open water, Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, further up the French coast to the northeast, was not part of the original plan. It became part of the story only because the September storm intervened and forced the fleet to regroup there. But its position is worth noting. It shortened the crossing by nearly a third, placing the English coast even closer and making the final gamble slightly more manageable. When you trace these 4 locations on a map, Dives, Saint-Valery, Pevensey, Hastings, what you see is a corridor, tight and exposed and entirely dependent on the cooperation of wind and tide. That is what made this invasion different from a land campaign. A general marching an army overland can pause, resupply, change route. A fleet commander in 1066 was at the mercy of conditions he could observe, but not control, and could predict only partially. Every day William waited at Dives, his horses needed feeding, his men needed paying, and his political credibility needed maintaining. The sea was not merely a physical barrier, It was a deadline, an adversary, and the whole reason the outcome of 1066 remained genuinely uncertain until the very moment the Norman keels touched the English shore. Everything that followed depended on getting that crossing right. Getting that crossing right began months before a single ship left the harbour. It began with timber. A clinker-built longship of the kind William's fleet would have relied upon required roughly 14 large oak trees, each one felled, split, and shaped into the overlapping planks that gave these vessels their characteristic ribbed flexibility. Multiply that number across a fleet of several hundred ships, and the scale becomes almost geological. You're talking about more than 10,000 oak trees stripped from Norman forests, floated down rivers to coastal yards, seasoned where possible and green where necessity demanded. Then the iron. Thousands of rivets driven through clinker planks, each one hammered and clenched by hand. Then the rope, great bundles of hemp and linen twisted into standing rigging and running lines. Then the sailcloth, woven and cut and stitched into panels broad enough to drive a heavy transport through a channel swell. Then the tar, the tallow, the provisions, the wine, the weapons. This was not a fleet that appeared. It was a fleet that was manufactured, systematically and deliberately, across the whole of Normandy and likely beyond its borders, in the months between William's decision to invade and his arrival at Dives-sur-Mer in the late summer of 1066. Norman lords contributed ships. Some of the great magnates offered dozens each, carved out of their own estates and their own labour pools. Abbeys and bishoprics contributed single vessels, their names sometimes recorded in documents that read less like inventories and more like acts of devotion. William's own flagship, the Mora, was a gift from his wife Matilda, a detail that the chroniclers preserve perhaps because it carried a certain elegance, the Queen sending her husband across the sea on a ship she had given him. What that network produced was not a spontaneous gathering of boats. It was a centralised military resource, coordinated by ducal officials, assembled to a plan. The ships were organised, provisioned, and crewed according to a hierarchy that reflected the feudal obligations binding William's vassals to his cause. This was one of the most deliberate acts of medieval logistics on record, and it helps explain why the fleet was capable of operating as a coherent force, rather than dissolving into individual captains pursuing individual interests. But how many ships exactly? Here the sources become complicated, and they deserve a moment of careful attention. The most frequently cited figure places roughly 777 vessels at Dives-sur-Mer before the fleet moved. After the September storm, which we will come to shortly, the surviving tally at Saint-Valery appears to be closer to 694, implying a loss somewhere around 80 to 85 ships. These numbers come from the so-called ship list, a document that historians treat as a serious attempt at accounting, along with the chronicle of master-waste writing in the 12th century. They are specific enough to suggest a real administrative record behind them. Someone was counting, or at least trying to. Other sources give different numbers entirely. Some medieval chroniclers place the fleet at 3,000 ships, a figure so far beyond the logistical and material capacity of 11th century Normandy that modern historians treat it as rhetoric rather than record. 3,000 ships would have been visible from the moon. It tells us something important about how medieval writers approached the past, not as a ledger of facts, but as an arena of prestige. The larger the fleet, the greater the Duke's power, and the more magnificent God's favour in allowing him to succeed. Inflating the numbers was not dishonesty in the modern sense. It was a particular kind of truth, a claim about significance rather than quantity. Even the more plausible figures carry uncertainty. A count of 777 vessels tells us nothing about the size or capacity of each ship, and the Norman fleet was emphatically not a fleet of identical craft. It combined at least two distinct classes of vessel, and probably more. The Snecchia, the slender war galley inherited from Scandinavian shipbuilding traditions, was long, shallow-drafted, and could be driven by both oars and sail. It was fast and manoeuvrable, and could be beached easily, which mattered enormously when landing on an unfamiliar shore without a proper harbour. The Canard, or cargo ship, was broader, deeper, sail only, and designed for carrying heavy loads across open water. Where a Snecchia might load around 10 horses alongside its crew, a mid-sized Canard could in theory accommodate a dozen horses or more, limited more by practical loading constraints than by raw deck space. Smaller carver vessels rounded out the mix, suited for lighter supplies and men who did not need the full depth of a transport hold. Imagining the Norman fleet as a single type of ship, a row of identical Viking longships stretching to the horizon, misrepresents what was actually a carefully considered mixture of function. War galleys to screen and protect the passage, heavy transports to carry the war horses and the armoured knights, supply craft carrying the food, the wine, the spare weapons, the milled grain that would keep an army functional in the days after landing, before the English countryside could be stripped to feed it. The sheer weight of material involved staggers the imagination when you try to hold it all at once. 7,000 men and up to 2,000 horses, armour for the knights, weapons for the infantry, fodder sufficient for the animals to survive a crossing that might last an entire night, water for men and beasts, the medical supplies, rough as they were, that an 11th century army carried, the carpenter's tools, the smith's equipment, the ropes and pulleys and portable equipment needed to consolidate a beachhead in enemy territory. All of it loaded onto ships that had no decks in the modern sense, exposed to channel weather, dependent on the wind. This is the scale that the chronicler's ship counts are trying to capture, even when they fail to capture it precisely. When a writer in the 12th century reaches for 3,000 ships, he's perhaps trying to convey something true about the magnitude of the undertaking, even if his arithmetic is useless. The honest number, somewhere in the range of 700 vessels if the better sources are believed, is itself extraordinary. No comparable fleet had been assembled in northern European waters within living memory. The organisational achievement alone, before a single oar was pulled, represented a transformation of Norman military power, and it rested on a single man's ability to hold that coalition together against the pressure of time. Every week the fleet waited at dives, the cost mounted. Horses consumed fodder at a rate that strained even the considerable resources of Normandy's hinterland. Men who were not fighting were men who were eating, grumbling, and occasionally deserting. The relationship between William and his captains, his nobles, his ecclesiastical backers, was one of mutual obligation. And mutual obligation has a finite patience. The fleet being assembled at Doves was not merely a military instrument. It was a political fact, and it required constant maintenance. That the fleet held together through months of waiting, through the storm that scattered it in September, through the subsequent regrouping at Saint-Valery, is itself evidence of how effectively William had organised the whole enterprise. He was not simply a warlord with ships, he was a commander who understood that an invasion fleet is an administrative problem as much as a nautical one, and who had built the institutional capacity to manage it. What he had created at Dives-sur-Mer by August of 1066 was, in effect, a floating town. A concentrated community of soldiers, sailors, craftsmen, grooms and provisions, bound together by a single objective and pointed at a coast 60 miles away. All it needed was the right wind, and the wind, with characteristic channel indifference, was not yet ready to cooperate. So what did that floating town actually contain? The figure that anchors everything else is deceptively simple. More than 7,000 men and up to 2,000 horses, distributed across somewhere between 700 and 800 ships, depending on which source you trust and which storm losses you factor in. 7,000 men is roughly the population of a prosperous medieval market town. 2,000 horses is a cavalry force of a size that most European powers of the era could only dream of concentrating in one place. Put them together on open water and you have one of the most audacious logistical acts of the 11th century, an act that required not just bravery from the people involved, but planning of an almost bureaucratic precision. Begin with the horses, because the horses were the central problem around which everything else was organised. The Norman cavalry was not simply a useful addition to William's army, it was the core of his tactical doctrine. Mounted knights fighting from the saddle, charging in formation, capable of breaking infantry lines and pursuing a retreating enemy, this was the weapon that made Norman armies dangerous in ways that their opponents struggled to answer. Harold's English forces at Hastings would be formidable in their shield wall, disciplined and courageous, but they were fundamentally an infantry force. William's army was not. Roughly a quarter of his fighting men were cavalry, and those men were only cavalry if their horses arrived on the English shore alive, uninjured, and capable of fighting. This created a pressure that ran through every decision about how the fleet was organised and when it would sail. A warhorse is not cargo in the ordinary sense. It is a living system with specific needs, a nervous disposition toward unfamiliar motion, a tendency to panic in tight spaces, and a daily requirement for food and water that does not pause simply because the logistics are difficult. Transporting 2,000 of them across 60 miles of open channel, in wooden ships without stabling, in the autumn season when weather in the channel is at its most unpredictable, this was an engineering challenge dressed up as a military one. The bayeux tapestry preserves the moment of embarkation in detail that seems almost casual until you stop and think about what it depicts. Horses are shown being led into ships, or in some panels appearing to leap over the ship's side, a detail that almost certainly reflects the real method, which involved coaxing or forcing the animals over the low freeboard of the clinker-built transports, sometimes using ramps, sometimes relying on the horse's own instinct to follow, sometimes relying on sheer human persistence. Getting a nervous warhorse aboard a rocking ship is not an activity that rewards impatience. Getting 2,000 of them aboard several hundred ships, in sequence, without losing control of the animals or the embarkation itself, required systematic organization and experienced handlers who knew their particular animals and could be trusted to work without constant supervision. Once aboard, the horses were almost certainly slung, supported by bands of cloth or leather passed under the belly, tied to the rigging or the gunwales, to prevent them from falling or thrashing if the ship rolled. Even so, the crossing would have been an ordeal for them. A horse that injures itself on the voyage, that arrives trembling and dehydrated, is not a horse ready to carry a knight into battle the following morning. William needed the animals to arrive not merely alive but functional, and this shaped the crossing plan in ways that are easy to overlook. He needed calm water, reasonable speed, and a landing that allowed the horses to recover. The supplies loaded alongside the men and animals tell their own story about the scale and ambition of the operation. The provisioning of the fleet drew on the full productive capacity of Normandy's rural economy. Salted bacon and beef, preserved against the lack of refrigeration that was simply a fact of medieval life. Cheese, hard-baked bread or biscuit, dried beans, foods chosen for their resistance to spoilage and their caloric density. Barrels of wine, which served both as a beverage and as a safer alternative to water that might go stale in cask. Water itself, stored in barrels for men and horses alike. And then the fodder, oats and corn for the horses, measured out not just for the crossing itself, but for the days immediately after landing. Before foraging, parties could reliably provision the army from the English countryside. The military equipment added another layer of weight and complexity. Hauberks, the long mail coats that Norman knights wore into battle, were heavy enough to drown a man who fell overboard wearing one. They were therefore packed rather than worn during the crossing, stored in bundles, rolled in oiled cloth against the salt air, ready to be unpacked and put on at the beach. Shields, helmets, lances, swords, the crossbow bolts and arrows for the archers, who made up perhaps a quarter of the fighting force. All of this was transported in a condition ready for immediate use. The fleet was not bringing raw material for an army that would be assembled after landing. It was bringing a complete fighting force that needed to be operational within hours of setting foot on English soil. That last point deserves emphasis because it transforms the way we understand the crossing. William had no guarantee that the English shore would be undefended. Harold had maintained his own fleet through the summer of 1066, watching the Channel precisely because he understood the threat from Normandy. If the invasion force landed and then needed days to organize itself, to unpack equipment, to rest horses, to establish command structures, it was vulnerable. The entire logistical apparatus of the fleet, the careful packing, the sequence loading, the decision about which ships carried what, was oriented toward a single goal. Arriving on the English shore ready to fight, not the next day, not after a period of consolidation, but immediately. This is what the phrase floating town actually means when you examine it closely. A town does not just house people, it organizes them, sustains them, and equips them for their function. The fleet assembled at Dives-sur-Mer, and later at Saint-Valery after the September storm rearranged everything, was a complete self-contained system. It had its fighting men in their three arms, cavalry, infantry, archers. It had its supply train, loaded and inventoried. It had its command hierarchy, its communication between ships, its chain of obligation running from the smallest auxiliary vessel all the way up to William's own flagship, the Mora, the ship his wife Matilda had given him. Nothing about it was improvised. Everything about it had been decided in advance. And yet the logistical pressure of simply sustaining this system while waiting for the wind was itself enormous. Horses consume roughly 10 kilograms of fodder per day. 2,000 horses consume 20 tons of fodder per day. Every day the fleet sat at anchor was another 20 tons of oats and corn drawn from stores that were finite. Every day was another several thousand men eating their way through the salted provisions that had been packed for the crossing. The window between army fully assembled and ready to sail and army beginning to consume itself through delay was not indefinitely wide. The logistical math had its own momentum, its own urgency, pressing William toward the crossing, even as the Channel winds refused to cooperate. What holds this entire picture together, and what tends to get lost when histories focus on the drama of the landing and the battle, is that the conquest was decided, at least in part, in warehouses and stables and naval yards, in the months before a single arrow flew at Hastings. The men who counted barrels of wine, who measured out fodder allowances, who organised the loading of 2,000 horses onto 700 ships, these men did not fight at Hastings, and they left no names in the chronicles. But without them, there was no crossing. Without the crossing, there was no battle. And without the battle, the England we know did not come to exist. Courage, when the moment came, would matter enormously. But courage without organisation is just bravery, and bravery does not cross the Channel in the dark. All of that organisation, all of those barrels and horses and mail coats, had to be loaded onto something. And what that something actually looked like, how it was built, how it moved, how it handled in the Channel swell, is a question that history answers only partially, through inference and careful reading of what little evidence survives. The honest position is this: we have no confirmed wreck from William's fleet. Not a single timber has been definitively identified as belonging to a ship that crossed in 1066. What we have instead is a convergence of sources that, taken together, allows us to reconstruct probable ship types with reasonable confidence, while acknowledging that the reconstruction remains exactly that. Probable, not certain. The closest thing to a contemporary illustration is the bayeux tapestry, and it rewards patient study. Panel 39 shows Norman vessels in the process of being loaded and then sailing, and the ships depicted share clear characteristics with the Scandinavian longship tradition that Norman shipbuilding had inherited. The hulls are clinker-built, constructed from overlapping planks riveted together, creating a flexible structure that could absorb the twisting stresses of open water better than a rigid frame. Each ship carries a single mast stepped roughly amidships, with one large square sail that catches the wind from behind or at a broad angle. Along the sides, oarports suggest the capacity for rowing when the wind failed or when precise manoeuvring was required. The prows carry dragon heads or stylized animal carvings, decorative perhaps, but also markers of identity, allowing commanders to distinguish their own vessels in a fleet of several hundred. The tapestry is not an engineering drawing, and it would be a mistake to treat it as one. Its embroiderers were recording something they recognized and understood, not providing specifications for future shipwrights. But the consistency of what they show, the clinker strakes, the single square sail, the oarports, the high curved stem and sternpost, aligns well enough with what archaeology has recovered from roughly contemporary Scandinavian vessels that we can use the tapestry as a starting point. Modern scholarship, drawing on those Viking-era parallels, proposes two principal classes of vessel within the invasion fleet, though it is worth being clear that the medieval sources do not name these classes, and the terminology is a modern scholarly convention applied to types inferred from context. The first type, sometimes called the snekkja in the literature borrowing from Old Norse, was a narrow, shallow-drafted war galley, perhaps around 25 metres long and 5 metres wide, capable of both sail and oar propulsion. The defining characteristic that made it militarily valuable was its draft, as little as half a metre when loaded. A vessel that draws only half a metre of water does not need a harbour. It does not need a jetty, a dock, or any infrastructure whatsoever. It can be rowed directly onto a beach, its bow grinding into the sand, its soldiers stepping over the side into ankle-deep water and walking ashore. In the context of an invasion that was planning to land on an unfamiliar coast, possibly under opposition, possibly in conditions that would make finding a harbour impossible or dangerous, this was not a minor advantage. It was central to the entire tactical conception of the landing. The second type, closer to the Norse knar, a broader, deeper-hulled cargo vessel, was the workhorse of the supply operation. It relied primarily on sail rather than oars, required a surprisingly small crew of perhaps half a dozen sailors, and could carry significantly more weight than its narrower companion. Estimates of horse-carrying capacity, and these estimates are genuinely uncertain, varying between reconstructions, suggest something on the order of 10 to 12 horses per vessel, with the horses arranged in rows and the total limited more by space than by the theoretical weight the hull could bear. The Nar type was slower, less nimble, and less capable of beaching on an open shore, but it was the vessel that would actually deliver the cavalry to England, and without it, the narrow war galleys with their limited cargo space could not have sustained the invasion force. These two types likely worked in a tactical relationship during the crossing. The oared galleys could move under their own power when the wind dropped, could scout ahead, could protect the flanks of the slower transports, and could reach the beach first to establish a perimeter before the cargo ships arrived. The transports held the muscle of the operation, the horses, the bulk of the supplies, the infantry equipment, but needed the crossing conditions and the protection that the faster vessels could provide. Life aboard during the loading and passage would have been a managed form of controlled chaos. Soldiers and servants worked alongside the small permanent crews, stacking and securing everything that the army would need in the hours after landing. The armour was packed, wrapped against the salt spray. The weapons were bundled and stowed. Barrels of wine and water were wedged against rolling. And then the horses were brought aboard, a process the tapestry shows with an almost matter-of-fact simplicity that somewhat understates the difficulty involved. Once at sea, the sailors handled the single sail, adjusting it to catch whatever wind was available, and took to the oars when necessary. The soldiers, for their part, were passengers in the most uncomfortable sense, confined in a small, moving wooden space, surrounded by anxious horses, unable to do much except manage their animals and endure the passage. One technical detail anchors the fleet's behaviour in harbour in a revealing way. The anchor chains of these vessels were relatively short, estimated at around 11 metres, which meant the ships could only anchor reliably in water shallower than about 6 metres. This was not a limitation that affected the crossing itself, but it shaped where the fleet could wait, which harbours and anchorages were actually usable, and how close to the shore the ships needed to stay during the long weeks of waiting for favourable winds. The anchorage at Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, where the fleet would eventually reassemble after the September storm, may have been chosen partly because it offered the right depth profile for a fleet with these constraints. All of this brings us back to the tactical pressure at the heart of the operation. William's window for crossing was not simply a matter of favourable wind, it was a race against the English response. Harold had his own fleet, his own scouts, his own understanding of the threat from the south. Every day the Norman fleet sat in harbour was another day for the English to reinforce their coastal positions, to move forces to where they might intercept a landing, to establish defensive lines that would make a beach assault costly even for a well-organised force. The shallow draft war galleys were a partial answer to this problem. They could land almost anywhere, denying Harold the ability to predict the exact landing point and concentrate his defence there. The speed of the cargo ships under a good south wind was another answer. The decision to cross at night, which would come later, was a third. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the Norman fleet was not a collection of improvised rafts or simple fishing boats pressed into emergency service. It was a purpose-built, purpose-organised collection of vessels drawing on a shipbuilding tradition refined over 2 centuries of Scandinavian seafaring, adapted to the specific demands of an amphibious operation at scale. The clinker-built hull that flexed in channel swells, the shallow draft that allowed beach landings without infrastructure, the combination of sail and oar that gave commanders some independence from the wind, these were not accidents of construction. They were design choices that reflected accumulated maritime knowledge, the kind of knowledge that gets passed from shipwright to shipwright and from sailor to sailor without ever being written down. We are left, in the end, inferring the ships from the image on the tapestry, from the parallels with excavated Viking-age vessels, from the logic of what the crossing required. The Norman fleet does not give us its wrecks to study. It gives us a battle that reshaped a civilization and leaves the ships themselves as shadows, probable, reconstructible in outline, but always slightly out of reach. That the crossing worked, that the horses arrived alive, that the army stepped ashore at Pevensey ready to fight, is itself the most compelling evidence we have that the ships were equal to what was asked of them. So the ships could do it. We have established that much. The clinker-built hulls, the shallow drafts, the combination of sail and oar. The engineering, as far as we can reconstruct it, was adequate to the channel crossing. But there was one element of the cargo that no hull design, no matter how well considered, could fully accommodate. One passenger that refused to cooperate with the neat logic of an amphibious operation: the warhorse. William's fleet carried somewhere between 1,800 and 2,000 of them. The estimates vary depending on how you read the chronicles and how you calculate the ratio of cavalry knights to support riders to spare mounts, but the scale is not in serious dispute. This was not a handful of horses accompanying a raiding party. This was a cavalry army, and cavalry armies in 1066 were defined by their horses in the same way that modern armoured units are defined by their tanks. The mounted knight, trained over years, bonded with an animal trained over the same years, was the decisive weapon of Norman warfare. Without the horses, William had infantry and archers but no strike force, no pursuit capability, no battlefield shock that could break an English shield wall. Everything depended on getting the horses across alive and fit to fight. That is a sentence that sounds straightforward and is anything but. Begin with the loading. A warhorse in 1066 was not a cart horse. It was a carefully selected, highly trained animal worth a small fortune, bred for aggression and responsiveness under conditions of extreme stress. That same responsiveness, the quality that made it devastating in battle, made it an extremely difficult animal to handle near water. Horses are naturally averse to entering enclosed spaces and instinctively suspicious of unstable ground. A ship's deck, even in harbour, moves. It shifts with the weight of cargo, rocks gently with the harbour swell, creaks and settles in ways that a horse can feel through its hooves and finds profoundly wrong. Loading a warhorse onto a medieval transport vessel required strength, patience, and in most cases a significant degree of luck. Medieval handlers knew this, and they developed techniques for it. Covering the horse's eyes, using calm animals to lead anxious ones, working with the animal's trust in a familiar handler rather than trying to force it with brute strength. But there was no technique that made it easy, and no technique that made it safe for everyone involved. The bayeux tapestry captures this moment with an image that is simultaneously vivid and puzzling. In what is now known as Panel 39, the embroiderers show horses being loaded onto ships. And what they depict is not a careful, managed process of leading animals up a ramp or lowering them by sling. The horses are jumping, or more precisely, they are being driven over the side of the vessel, entering the water and presumably swimming or wading the short distance to the ship's hull. It is a chaotic image, full of energy, the horses' legs extended in mid-air, their riders or handlers urging them forward. Scholars debate exactly what this scene shows, whether it depicts embarkation at Dives or disembarkation at Pevensey, or some conflation of both. But as a document of the fundamental awkwardness of the whole enterprise, it is irreplaceable. These animals did not walk calmly onto ships. They were coaxed and driven and, if necessary, compelled. And the same scene played out in reverse on the English shore. Once aboard, the problem changed in character, but not in difficulty. A horse on a ship at sea is a horse in a state of permanent anxiety. The movement of the hull, the spray, the noise of the rigging, the smell of salt water, the absence of solid ground under its feet, all of it works against the animal's instincts. Horses that panic on confined wooden decks do not simply buck and settle. They kick, they lunge, they can stave in planking, injure crew, injure other horses, and in extreme cases capsize a vessel if enough of them move in the same direction simultaneously. In anything rougher than calm water, a frightened horse becomes genuinely dangerous cargo in a way that a barrel of wine or a stack of armour simply does not. Medieval practice addressed this through a combination of physical constraint and spatial management. Scholars working from later medieval records, English ship requisitions from the 13th and 14th centuries are particularly useful here, have identified a range of techniques that were likely in use or developing during this period. Wooden stalls or hurdles created individual compartments that limited how far a horse could move, preventing the kind of lateral lunge that could destabilize a hull. Canvas slings, passed under the horse's belly and attached to overhead fittings, provided support that kept the animal from falling when the deck rolled and reduced the physical strain of standing on a moving surface. These slings also had a calming effect, something like the swaddling effect documented in other contexts. The gentle but firm pressure of the canvas seemed to reduce the horse's anxiety responses. Whether these specific fittings were present on William's vessels in 1066 is an inference from later practice rather than a documented fact, but the inference is reasonable. The logistical challenges were real, the solutions were not technically complex, and the people managing the crossing had every reason to use whatever worked. Space was the other tyranny. Each horse required not just room to stand, but room to stand safely, with enough clearance that a kick or a sideways movement would not injure a neighbour and trigger a chain reaction. Fodder, oats or grain, took up additional space, as did the water that horses required in quantities that a sealed barrel supply could only partially meet across a channel crossing. The combined footprint of a horse, its stall fittings, its fodder allocation, and the handler space around it was substantial. Estimates based on the cargo capacity of the Nar-type transport vessels suggest something on the order of 10 to 12 horses per ship, which means that moving 2,000 horses required roughly 200 dedicated horse transports, ships that could not simultaneously carry other cargo in equivalent quantities. That is not a small fraction of William's fleet. It is a significant portion of his entire logistical capacity committed to a single, irreplaceable asset. This shaped the order of operations in ways that are easy to overlook. Horses, because of their space requirements, were among the last cargo loaded. You filled the holds with supplies first, then brought the animals aboard when the ship was otherwise ready. But horses, because of their tactical value and their vulnerability, needed to be among the first cargo landed. A cavalry army that disembarks its infantry first and brings its horses ashore into an already chaotic beach scene, surrounded by hundreds of soldiers, noise, and movement, is courting exactly the kind of panic that makes horses dangerous. The horses needed to come off the ships onto relatively clear ground, with handlers ready, with space to settle before the full confusion of a beach landing surrounded them. This created a sequencing problem that William's commanders had to solve in advance, and the solution, positioning the horse transports to land early, keeping a corridor clear on the beach, having dedicated handlers ready on the shore, required exactly the kind of coordinated planning that the entire crossing demanded at every level. The storm that followed the departure from Dives-sur-Mer made all of this brutally concrete. The slower transport vessels, the very ships carrying the horses, were the ones that suffered most when the wind shifted and the seas rose. The Chronicle record notes the loss of horses along with supplies, and it is not difficult to understand why. A terrified horse on a storm-tossed ship straining against its canvas slings, kicking against its wooden stall, responding to the very violence of the water with the full force of a panicking 1,000-pound animal, was capable of doing serious damage to its vessel. Some horses were almost certainly thrown overboard deliberately when it became clear they were endangering the ship. Others died from the crossing itself. The stress, the cold, the physical toll of standing in storm conditions for hours. The miracle of the operation in retrospect is not that some horses were lost. It is that most of them arrived. That when William stepped ashore at Pevensey, his cavalry force was largely intact, his horses fit enough to be ridden into battle within days. The logistics had worked, imperfectly and expensively, but well enough. The channel had been crossed, the horses had made it, and what awaited them on the English shore was a different kind of problem entirely. The horses had made it, but first they had to leave. And leaving, as William of Normandy understood by late summer of 1066, was proving far more complicated than arriving had ever been. Dives-sur-Mer sits at the mouth of the Dives River on the Normandy coast, tucked into a sheltered inlet that opens directly onto the channel. It is not an obvious place in the way that a large natural harbour is obvious. It does not announce itself. But for a commander planning a crossing to the English south coast, it possessed one quality that overrode every other consideration. When the prevailing southwest wind blew, a fleet leaving Dives would be pushed almost exactly in the direction it needed to go. The geography aligned with the meteorology in a way that felt almost designed. William had not chosen Dives for sentiment or convenience. He had chosen it because a southwest wind out of that inlet pointed like an arrow toward Pevensey. By mid-August the fleet was assembled, nearly 777 vessels by the most credible contemporary estimates, oared war galleys riding alongside heavier cargo ships and horse transports, the whole floating inventory of an invasion arrayed in the sheltered water and along the riverbanks. Somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 men, depending on which chronicler you trust, up to 2,000 horses, stores of food and wine and armour, the entire material apparatus of conquest, floating in a Norman river, waiting for the right wind to carry it north. On the night before the intended departure, 475 barons and knights gathered for mass at Dives, a moment that had the quality of both ceremony and supplication, men commending themselves to God before committing themselves to the sea. Then the wind turned wrong and stayed wrong. A north wind pinned the fleet in harbour. Days passed, and then weeks. 6 weeks, by the best reconstruction we have, during which the fleet sat idle, and the army ate through its supplies, grew restless, and tested the patience of its commander in ways that great campaigns tend to do when they are forced to wait for weather. William was not passive during this delay. He used the time to complete ships still under construction, to continue drilling his forces, to manage the 1,000 administrative crises that arise whenever thousands of men and animals are concentrated in one place for longer than anyone intended. He rationed food. He enforced discipline. He kept the army together when every instinct of a feudal force with independent nobles at its head was to begin dispersing. But he could feel the pressure building. The aristocracy of Normandy, Brittany and Flanders had committed their men and their fortunes to this enterprise on the understanding that it would happen. Every day in harbour was a day of mounting costs and mounting doubt. The north wind was not an abstraction. It was a daily reminder that the Channel did not answer to anyone's timetable, and that the entire magnificent, terrifyingly expensive operation might simply be undone by weather, the way so many ambitious plans had been undone before. William understood, because he had to understand, that an army that waits too long stops being an army. Then, finally, the wind shifted. A southwest breeze came in off the Atlantic, exactly what he had been waiting for, exactly what the position at Dives had been chosen to exploit. The moment the shift was confirmed, felt by pilots, observed in the water and the rigging and the movement of birds, the order went out. 6 weeks of waiting collapsed into the ordered urgency of embarkation. Try to hold that moment for a second, because it is easy to let the logistical scale crowd out the human reality of it. These were men who had spent 6 weeks on ships and riverbanks, eating reduced rations, watching the sky, praying and quarrelling and sleeping badly. They had crossed the Channel in imagination 100 times already, had lived through the landings and the battles and the triumphs so often in their minds that the actual departure carried with it an almost surreal quality. The thing finally beginning, the waiting ending, the real risk replacing the imagined one. Whatever fear they carried it forward. The fleet moved out of Dives-sur-Mer into the Channel, and with it went the collected ambitions of the Norman world. The faster oared warships led the way, their crews pulling in rhythm, their hulls lower in the water and more responsive to command than the heavy transports following behind. This difference in speed, which seemed in the moment like a manageable detail of fleet formation, would become absolutely critical within hours. The fleet that left Dives was not a single thing moving at a single pace. It was a collection of vessels spread across a spectrum of capability, unified by purpose but not by performance. The war galleys could maintain headway even against a moderate wind shift. The horse transports, loaded to their margins with animals and fodder and gear, were at the mercy of the wind in a much more complete way. When the southwest breeze held, they moved together. When it did not, they would begin to separate. For now the wind held. The Norman coast fell behind. England lay somewhere in the haze to the north, close enough in theory, barely 30 miles at the Channel's narrowest, but experienced from a low medieval deck as a vast indifferent distance. The men on those ships had almost no reliable way of measuring how the crossing was going. They could feel the wind, watch the set of the sail, read the colour of the water and the behaviour of the waves, consult with the pilots who navigated by accumulated experience and instinct rather than instruments. What they could not do was predict what the sky would do next. The Channel in early September is not an especially forgiving sea. It has its own weather, generated by the interaction of Atlantic systems with the North Sea and the land masses on either side, and it changes faster than most sailors are comfortable with. There was hope aboard those ships, and there was something that looked very much like relief. The relief of action after waiting, of commitment after uncertainty. William had staked everything on this departure. His authority in Normandy, his claim on England, the loyalty of his barons, the promises made to the Pope who had blessed the enterprise. All of it was now at sea with him, riding on the same southwest wind that filled every sail. The chronicles do not give us William's internal state in this moment, and we should be cautious about inventing it. What we can say is that he had done everything within his power to make this crossing possible. The fleet was built, The men were trained, the route was chosen, the timing was as good as 6 weeks of bad weather had allowed it to be. And then the wind changed. Not dramatically, not all at once. These things rarely announce themselves with the clarity they acquire in retrospect. But the shift was real, and it was in exactly the wrong direction, from southwest to west, then from west to northwest. The same Atlantic system that had finally given William his departure window began to reshape itself into something more dangerous, and the fleet that had left Dives in hope started to feel it. The faster ships, the oared galleys, the lighter vessels, could work against a heading wind, could row when the sail became useless, could choose their course with a degree of independence. The horse transports, the heavy supply ships, the wallowing cargo vessels with their live and terrified passengers had no such options. The wind that was now pushing from the northwest was pushing them along the Normandy coast rather than across the Channel, driving them east toward the Alabaster coast rather than north toward England. The fleet was beginning to scatter. The crossing that had started with such hard-won momentum was turning into something else, something neither William nor his pilots could control by will or seamanship alone. The storm that had been building at the edge of the horizon was now arriving, and what it would do to 777 ships, to thousands of men, to 2,000 horses, to the entire enterprise of conquest. That reckoning was still a few violent hours away. But those aboard the slower ships already knew, in the way that sailors always know before they can say it plainly, that the sea had changed its mind about letting them through. What happened next belongs to the category of events that history records in numbers but can only be understood through imagination. The numbers are these: 777 ships left Dives-sur-Mer. Roughly 694 were counted at Saint-Valery-sur-Somme after the storm passed. Somewhere between those two figures, approximately 83 vessels disappeared, driven onto rocks, swamped in open water, broken apart on the cliffs of the Alabaster coast, while the men and animals aboard them went into the sea. The difference between those two numbers is a measure of catastrophe. But here is the first thing that must be said about this storm, before anything else. We know it almost entirely through a single source. William of Poitiers, chaplain to the Conqueror and the author of the Gesta Guilhelmi, is the contemporary Norman chronicle that carries the weight of this narrative. He wrote with loyalty to his patron, with rhetorical training, and with purposes that were not purely documentary. Later meteorological reconstructions have added texture, wind direction sequences, pressure pattern analysis, the kind of retrospective climate science that can sometimes confirm or complicate medieval accounts. But the storm story as we tell it is, at its core, the story that one educated Norman priest chose to preserve. This does not make it false. It means we hold it carefully, and we listen to what it says knowing that other voices, from the other side of the Channel, from the ships that never returned, are permanently silent. With that caveat carried forward, the wind did what the worst winds do. It did not arrive as a single dramatic event, but as a progressive betrayal, each shift making things worse than the last had suggested they could get. Southwest to west, west to northwest. Each change in heading pushed the Norman fleet not across the Channel but along it, turning a crossing into a forced transit of the Normandy coast, carrying ships toward the pale limestone cliffs that give the Alabaster coast its name, and that offered, to a vessel being driven broadside by a gale, nothing more forgiving than a white wall. The fleet separated according to its own internal physics. The oared warships, lighter, lower, crewed by men who could pull against a headwind when the sail became useless, had options. Not good options, not safe options, but options. They could alter course, could row for a headland, could seek the relative shelter of an inlet, or wait out the worst of the wind in water that was merely dangerous rather than immediately fatal. These were the ships that carried the fighting men, the knights, and their mounted retinues, the core of William's strike force. Their greater manoeuvrability was not incidental. It was the product of a design philosophy that understood speed and control as military assets, because war galleys were built to deliver soldiers, and soldiers needed to arrive. The horse transports and supply ships had no such flexibility. Loaded to their capacity with animals that could not be reasoned with and gear that could not be redistributed in mid-storm, they sat high and heavy and unresponsive in the water, their broad hulls catching every gust. When the wind pushed northwest, they went with it. They were driven east and then southeast along the coast toward the cliffs, with their pilots fighting rudders and their crews managing lines in conditions that were not designed to be managed. Some ran aground on beaches, some were pushed onto rock. Some, we must assume, simply broke apart in open water before they ever reached the coast. Their cargoes, food, fodder, wine, armour, and the horses themselves, going down into water cold enough in September to kill quickly. The Gesta Guglielmi describes terrible shipwrecks. It mentions bodies washing ashore, and then it records something that carries more weight than any ship count. William ordered the dead to be buried secretly. He had the bodies concealed, the wrecks hidden from sight to whatever extent was possible, the full scale of the disaster managed away from the eyes of the men who remained. This was not sentiment. This was crisis leadership of a specific and calculating kind. An army that saw dozens or hundreds of its own dead laid out on a Norman beach, saw the horses they had trained and loaded and coaxed through 6 weeks of waiting, now washed up broken in the shallows. That army would begin to calculate its own odds in a different way. William needed his men to believe the storm was a setback, not an omen. The secret burials were an act of narrative management as much as anything else. A commander trying to control the story his own soldiers were telling themselves. How many men died? The chronicles do not give us a clean figure, and we should be suspicious of any account that does. The 83 ships lost from Dives to Saint-Valery represent roughly 10% of the fleet. If those ships were even partially crewed and loaded, and the heaviest transports were among the most vulnerable, the human cost ran to dozens at minimum, possibly into the hundreds. Men who had crossed to England in intention a dozen times during 6 weeks of waiting, and who now drowned within sight of the coast they had set out from. Add to them the horses that could not swim and the stores that sank, and the loss begins to look less like a percentage and more like an amputation. The invasion had just lost a significant portion of its logistical foundation. Replacement food and fodder would have to be found somewhere along the Normandy coast before William could even consider attempting the Channel again. There is something in this episode that deserves to be called what it was, the moment the entire enterprise came closest to ending before it began. Not at Hastings, not on the beach at Pevensey, but here, in a September gale off the Alabaster coast, with horse transports grinding against limestone and bodies drifting in the tide. Harold Godwinson, waiting in England with his army, may never have known how close the weather came to doing his work for him. The storm was not an inconvenience in the margin of a great military campaign. It was a protagonist, with its own agenda, indifferent to the ambitions of the most powerful duke in northern France. If the wind had held northwest for another 12 hours, or if the ratio of fast warships to slow transports had been reversed, the story of England might have resolved itself in the North Sea rather than on a hill above Hastings. Instead, the fleet regrouped. The surviving warships made for the mouth of the Somme, where Saint-Valery-sur-Somme offered a sheltered anchorage and a chance to count what remained. The slower vessels that had survived by beaching rather than breaking apart were refloated where possible, repaired where necessary, abandoned where neither was an option. William gathered his commanders and took stock of what the sea had returned to him. It was less than he had started with, and it was enough, barely, arguably, contingently enough, to try again. But the next crossing would have to wait for conditions that would not repeat the disaster, and Saint-Valery lay further east than Dives, adding miles and angle to an already complex navigational problem. The storm-born secrets buried in that stretch of Normandy coast, the men in unmarked graves, the horses in uncharted shallows, the supplies that fed no one, are not findable now. No wrecks from the 1066 storm have been identified with certainty. The sea that took those ships keeps its own inventory. What we have is William of Poitiers telling us what his duke chose to remember and what he chose to conceal, written with the knowledge that the campaign eventually succeeded and that success redeems many things that failure would have condemned. The storm appears in later tellings as a trial survived, a danger past, a proof of divine favour that protected what remained and brought William through to his eventual triumph. But read more carefully, in the only account close enough to the events to carry direct weight, it looks like something rawer and less providential. A military operation brought to the edge of ruin by a wind shift on an autumn afternoon, saved by the accident that the fastest ships carried the fighting men, and held together afterward by a commander who understood that armies run on belief as much as supplies, and that the first thing to manage after catastrophe is the story of it. 83 ships, roughly 10%. Close enough to matter, not quite enough to stop him. The mouth of the Somme is not a dramatic place. It opens gradually, the river widening into a broad estuary of mudflats and pale water before it reaches the sea, sheltered on its northern bank by the town of Saint-Valery-sur-Somme. In the autumn of 1066, this quiet geography became one of the most consequential anchorages in European history. The battered Norman fleet came here because it had to, because after a storm that had scattered ships across the Normandy coast and driven the heaviest transports onto cliffs and beaches, the mouth of the Somme offered something that Dives-sur-Mer, exposed and now associated in every man's memory with the taste of disaster, could no longer provide. It offered shelter, it offered time, and time, in William's condition, was the most dangerous gift imaginable. The anchorage at Saint-Valery was genuinely better suited to waiting than Dives had been. The estuary reduced the fetch of incoming swells, gave shallow-drafted vessels a place to lie without swinging on open moorings, and put the fleet within a shorter, more northerly angle of approach to the English coast. These were practical advantages that a competent military planner would recognise immediately. But Saint-Valery was also further east than Dives, which meant the surviving fleet had been pushed along the coast by the very storm that had savaged it, rescued from the worst of the weather partly by the same wind that had done the damage. The anchorage was both refuge and reminder. Every ship that lay in the Somme estuary was there because the sea had decided to let it survive, and not every ship had received the same decision. What William found when he took stock at Saint-Valery was approximately 694 vessels. The storm's arithmetic laid out plainly. Replacement of stores began immediately. Fodder for the remaining horses, food for thousands of men who had been delayed weeks beyond any reasonable estimate of the campaign's duration, wine and provisions that had gone into the sea with the lost transports. All of it had to be found, requisitioned, loaded again. The logistical machinery that had assembled 6 weeks of supplies at Dives was now grinding through a second iteration, under worse conditions, with a smaller fleet and an army whose confidence had absorbed a serious blow. William of Poitiers, writing in the Gesta Guilhelmi with the characteristic loyalty of a court chronicler, but enough proximity to the events to carry weight, tells us that the Duke daily increased supplies, alleviated want, and by various encouragements retained the terrified and put heart into the fearful. This is panegyric language, shaped for a patron's glory, but it almost certainly describes something real, a commander conducting intensive morale maintenance in a camp that had seen what the sea could do and was not eager to return to it. And then William of Poitiers records something stranger, something that shifts the texture of the account from official biography into something darker. He tells us that William concealed the loss of those who drowned by burying them in secret, the bodies that had washed ashore, men who had crossed the channel in intention and never crossed it in fact, who had drowned within sight of the coast they had left, were taken up quietly, carried away from the sight of the living army, and put into the ground without ceremony, without the kind of formal reckoning that makes death countable and therefore visible. The disaster was not to be read in faces or in rows of graves. The story of the storm, as the surviving army was permitted to understand it, was to be a story of setback survived, not of catastrophe absorbed. This detail sits in the historical record almost alone. William of Poitiers is the only contemporary source who mentions the secret burials. Orderic Vitalis, writing a generation later with access to earlier accounts, does not include it. William of Jumièges is silent on it. What this means is genuinely open. Either the burial happened, and only Poitiers preserved it, which would make it one of those details that history keeps by accident and nearly loses, or Poitiers invented or embellished it as part of a rhetorical portrait of his duke's wisdom and command, a man so attentive to his army's spirit that he managed even the visibility of death. The honest answer is that we cannot be certain which reading is correct, and this uncertainty is itself part of the story. The hidden dead may be hidden twice, once in unmarked Normandy graves, and once in the silence of sources that chose not to see them. What is not in doubt is the broader landscape of fear and calculation, in which those burials, real or not, would have made complete sense. An army waiting in an estuary after a catastrophic storm, watching the same sky that had just killed its companions, is an army capable of dissolving. The medieval military compact was not purely coercive. Men in William's force had come because of obligation, because of promised reward, because of the particular magnetism of a duke who had spent 15 years demonstrating that following him paid better than opposing him. But that compact had conditions, and one of its conditions was that the enterprise had to seem viable. A beach covered with bodies does not seem viable. It seems like a sign, and the medieval world read signs with a literalism that modern sensibilities underestimate. If God had wanted this invasion to succeed, why had he sent a storm? This was not a rhetorical question in 1066. It was a sincere theological inquiry, and it required a sincere theological answer. William provided one, or at least he reached for the materials to construct one. According to the chronicle account, he had the relics of Saint-Valery, the patron saint of the town itself, brought out and paraded before the assembled army, and he walked the beach in prayer, calling on the saint to intercede for favourable winds. Whether this is literally what happened or whether Poitiers shaped the scene for maximum narrative effect, the underlying logic is clear. The storm was not God's rejection of the enterprise. The continued waiting was not abandonment. The favourable wind would come because the saints were listening, because the cause was righteous, because God's silence was not the same as God's refusal. The relics on the beach were a counter-narrative made tangible, a physical argument that the heavens had not yet rendered their final verdict. Woven through all of this was a figure larger than Saint-Valery himself, St. Michael, the great military archangel, patron of soldiers and sailors and of heights above the sea. The timing of William's eventual departure was not accidental. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, recording events from the other side of the Channel, notes the crossing on Sancta Michaelis Messaefen, the eve of Michaelmas, the feast of St. Michael, falling on the 28th and 29th of September. The choice to depart on the eve of that particular feast was a statement, legible to everyone in the army who kept a liturgical calendar, which was essentially everyone. The crossing was being placed under the archangel's protection, aligned with his feast as a declaration of divine favour. Mont Saint-Michel, the great tidal island on Normandy's western coast, had already appeared earlier in the campaign's story. It would appear again in the bayeux tapestry, depicted with particular prominence among the early scenes. The Normans were not invaders operating in a theological vacuum. They were crusaders of a kind, marching under heaven's approval, and every piece of symbolic timing was a brick in that argument. The miracle stories that accumulated around Saint-Valery, the relics, the prayers, the archangel's feast day crossing, did something more than comfort a frightened army in the moment. They became the architecture of memory through which the campaign would later be understood. By the time Poitiers finished his chronicle, by the time the tapestry was stitched, the waiting at Saint-Valery had been transformed from its actual character, anxious, expensive, demoralizing, punctuated by the secret disposal of evidence, into a period of purification and divine alignment, a delay that God had imposed for his own reasons and then resolved with his own winds. The fear that had driven the secret burials was edited out. What remained was the faith that had paced the beach with relics. Both things were true at once, and this is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about Saint-Valery. It was a place where men waited in genuine terror, where William made cold calculations about what his army could afford to see and know and believe, and where stories began to form that would outlast every man who was present for them. The hidden dead stayed hidden. The saints' relics went back into their reliquary. The wind eventually changed. The wind changed, but William did not move the moment it did. This is the detail that separates a desperate gamble from a calculated operation, and it is worth sitting with. After weeks of waiting, after the storm, after the secret burials, after the relics on the beach and the prayers to Saint-Valery, the moment when the wind finally shifted must have felt like a release of almost unbearable pressure. Every day at Saint-Valery had cost something. Fodder, provisions, confidence. The narrowing window before autumn made the channel genuinely impassable for months, and yet when the conditions began to change, the fleet did not lurch immediately into the water. It waited a little longer. It read the sky and the tide. It chose its moment with a precision that tells us a great deal about the kind of seafaring knowledge that was operating beneath the surface of this entire enterprise. What the Normans were doing at Saint-Valery in the days before the final departure was something that mariners of the medieval Channel had been doing for generations, building a cognitive map of the water between them and their destination. This was not intuition, and it was not guesswork. It was a practical, accumulated discipline of observation, the kind of knowledge that Roger of Howden would attempt to codify in his sailing directions for the English coast, written around 1170, a century after the invasion. Howden's guide listed the landmarks that a navigator should look for: the white cliffs, the river mouths, the sandbanks that ran close to the surface in ways invisible until a keel found them. It described how a sailor could judge the direction and speed of tidal currents by watching floating debris, by reading the colour and texture of the water, by understanding that the same channel behaved differently depending on where you were in the tidal cycle. Howden wrote it down a generation after the conquest, but he was writing down knowledge that already existed, that had been carried in the minds and habits of men who crossed this water regularly and survived it by knowing it better than it knew them. The tidal streams of the channel were not incidental to William's plan. They were central to it. Modern hydrographic reconstruction, working backward from current tidal models to compute the conditions that would have prevailed in late September 1066, has produced something genuinely illuminating, a detailed picture of what the Somme estuary's tides were doing in the hours around the Norman departure. What those calculations show is that the ebb tide flowing southwest out of the Somme ran at somewhere between 2 and 3 knots. For a fleet of heavily laden transport vessels, many of them carrying horses and armour, and the entire logistical weight of a continental army, that current was not a trivial advantage. It was the difference between making reasonable progress under sail and fighting your own anchorage. An opposing flood tide would have stalled the slowest ships and fragmented the fleet before it was even clear of the estuary. The mathematics of the crossing, at least as modern tidal modelling reconstructs them, strongly suggest that the Norman commanders understood this, that they were waiting not merely for a favourable wind, but for the alignment of wind and tide that together would give the whole armada its best chance of arriving as a coherent force. The wind shift itself came on the 27th or 28th of September, 1066, by the Julian calendar. The meteorological reconstruction published by J. Neumann in 1986, drawing on both the Gesta Guglielmi and a range of medieval climate chronicles, confirms what the chronicle accounts describe, that early September had been stormy and difficult, that the channel had sat under conditions hostile to a loaded fleet, and that the wind shift to a southerly direction in the last days of September represented something genuinely unusual, a brief, favourable window that opened and would not stay open indefinitely. Neumann was working from documentary sources rather than instrument records, which means his reconstruction carries the same caveats that attach to all such exercises, but the broad shape of the picture is consistent across multiple independent sources. The southwesterly that had pinned the fleet at Saint-Valery gave way to a southerly and a southerly wind, blowing from behind a fleet heading roughly north-northwest toward Pevensey, was precisely the condition that made the crossing viable. What makes this moment interesting is not the meteorology in isolation. It is the intersection of that meteorology with the decision-making of men who could not read a forecast, had no barometer, no weather satellite, no tidal table printed on waterproof paper. What they had was everything that the sailors of the Channel had accumulated across decades of watching the same water, the recognition that certain cloud formations preceded certain wind shifts, that the behaviour of the tide at the river mouth gave information about what the outer estuary was doing, that the particular quality of light on the horizon in the evening could tell you something about the next morning's wind. This was not mysticism. It was empirical observation refined by experience into something close to expertise. Coordinating that expertise across hundreds of vessels was its own challenge. The fleet at Saint-Valery, even after the storm's reduction, comprised close to 700 ships of varying sizes and capabilities. The faster oared galleys could make better time in light conditions. The slower, broader transport vessels, weighed down with horses and provisions, needed more wind and more time. The departure had to be orchestrated so that the armada arrived at the English coast not as a scattered procession, but as a concentrated force capable of landing under whatever opposition it might meet. This meant staggering the departure sequence, allowing the slower ships to lead or to begin earlier, using the tidal window to pull the whole fleet forward at roughly comparable speeds, ensuring that the commanders in the faster vessels understood the need to hold formation rather than race ahead. The logistics of this coordination, invisible in the chronicle accounts, represent a genuine feat of pre-modern military organisation that relies entirely on the mariners' shared knowledge of how the water behaved. It is worth pausing here over the gap between what the chronicles emphasise and what the sea actually required. The medieval accounts of the crossing talk about relics and prayers and divine favour and the feast of St. Michael. These things were real in their context and should not be condescended to. They were how the men aboard those ships understood and narrated their own experience, and they served genuine functions in maintaining cohesion and courage. But alongside the theology ran a parallel technical conversation that the chronicles mostly do not record. The consultations between experienced shipmasters about the tidal state, the assessments of cloud cover and wind direction in the hours before departure, the decisions about loading order and sailing sequence that would determine whether 700 ships could be turned from an anchorage into an invasion. William's final decision to sail was not a leap of faith. It was a calculation, informed by everything that the mariners around him knew about this particular stretch of water at this particular season, confirmed by conditions that finally, briefly, aligned. Modern science can illuminate that alignment without displacing the medieval story. The retrotidal models and meteorological reconstructions do not reveal something the Normans didn't know. They confirm something they did know in a different language, using different instruments. The Norman sailors reading floating debris in the Somme estuary and the hydrographer running computational tidal models for 1066 are asking the same question. When does the water run right? The medieval answer, encoded in experience and transmitted through practice, arrived at the same moment that the modern answer, encoded in mathematics and transmitted through academic journals, identifies as optimal. The crossing was not made possible by faith alone, nor by calculation alone. It was made possible by the convergence of a rare weather window, a carefully chosen anchorage, accumulated maritime knowledge, and a commander who understood that the sea offers its opportunities briefly, and punishes those who hesitate past them. The wind was southerly, the tide was ebbing, the night was coming. They went at dusk. The signal to weigh anchor moved through the fleet in the last light of the 27th of September, 1066, and the Normans began to move, not all at once, not in a single chaotic surge, but in the measured sequence that the shipmasters had prepared for. The slower transports leading out from the Somme estuary, while the wind held steady from the south, and the ebb tide ran beneath them like a drawn breath. For the men aboard those vessels, the sensation of finally moving after weeks of waiting must have been something between relief and terror. The two feelings so close together they were almost indistinguishable. Within hours, they were in open water, and the coastline of Normandy had disappeared behind them into the dark. The night that closed around the fleet was genuinely profoundly dark. There was no moon. The chronicles that describe the crossing note this detail almost in passing, but its practical significance was enormous. A modern crossing of the Channel at night, even in a small vessel, gives some sense of what darkness without artificial light means on open water, the way the horizon dissolves, the way the difference between sky and sea becomes ambiguous, the way a cluster of lights 2 miles away can be mistaken for a star until it moves. For a fleet of several hundred ships, some oared, some purely sail-driven, many of them carrying the unfamiliar weight of horses and armour and provisions, maintaining any kind of coherent formation in that darkness was a problem that had no obvious solution. William had one. His flagship, the Mora, a vessel gifted to him by his wife Matilda, and reportedly among the fastest in the fleet, carried a lantern at its masthead. This single light, burning in the dark above the channel, was the axis around which the entire armada was meant to orient itself. Every ship that could see the Mora's light knew its direction. Every navigator who could keep that beacon in view knew that he was, at least approximately, where he was supposed to be. It was a simple solution to a genuinely difficult problem, and its simplicity was its genius. No elaborate signalling system, no messenger boats running between flagships, no shouted orders across black water. One light. Follow it. Whether every ship in a fleet of nearly 700 could actually see that lantern at all times is another matter. The channel is rarely still, and a loaded transport rising and falling on even moderate swells would have lost the light repeatedly, found it again, lost it, found it. A lurching navigation by a single fading star. The faster galleys could keep station more easily. The slower transports, wallowing under their cargoes, would have done what they could. What the lantern provided was not perfect coordination. It provided a reference point, something to aim for when the dark became disorienting, something to search for when a vessel had drifted or fallen behind. In the absence of any better technology, it was enough. Below decks, or on the open planking of the transport hulls, the experience of the crossing was something that no chronicle adequately conveys. Knights did not wear their armour. This was not ceremony or oversight. It was sound nautical sense. The recognition that a man in full mail who went over the side in darkness and deep water was simply dead, whereas a man in a tunic had some chance. The armour was stowed, packed, bundled against the motion of the ship. The weapons were secured, the provisions were lashed down, and the horses, those 2,000 or so war horses without which the Norman cavalry would land as infantry, were tethered on deck or in the open hulls, their legs braced against the movement, their breath rising in the September night air in small clouds that the sailors moved among, checking the ropes, managing the weight, doing what they could to keep animals that were not designed for this from injuring themselves or each other in the dark. A frightened horse on a moving ship is one of the more dangerous things that medieval naval transport had to contend with. The weight shifts unpredictably, the animal can kick, and in the dark with the hull rolling, a horse that breaks its tether becomes a crisis that can spread to every other animal nearby. The Norman shipmasters who had planned this crossing had thought about this problem. The tethering arrangements were deliberate, the distribution of the animals across the vessels calculated to manage the centre of gravity. None of this is described in detail in the chronicles, but it is implied by the fact that the fleet arrived at Pevensey with its cavalry intact and combat ready. The horses crossed. They arrived, which means the men managing them in the dark on the water through the night did their work. For the commanders aboard the Mora and the other leading vessels, the hours of the crossing were a sustained exercise in controlled uncertainty. William could not see his fleet. He knew it was behind him because he had organised its departure, because the lantern above him was the beacon they were following, because the plan called for them to be there. But the black water between one ship and the next held no information. A vessel that had run aground on a shoal, or lost its mast to a squall, or simply drifted off course in the dark, it would not be visible until dawn. The commanders of a pre-modern fleet crossing in darkness had to trust their preparations because they had no way to verify them. The discipline of the departure, the tidal timing, the lantern, the staggered sailing sequence, all of it was an attempt to make the outcome as predictable as possible in conditions that were inherently not. And there were real risks waiting in that darkness beyond the mechanical ones. The English coast was not undefended in concept, even if it proved undefended in fact. Harold Godwinson had maintained a naval watch through the summer, a fleet stationed along the Channel coast to intercept exactly this kind of crossing. By late September, that fleet had been stood down, provisions exhausted, the sailing season apparently ending. But the Norman commanders crossing in the dark could not have known with certainty that the watch was gone. The possibility of English ships in the night, of torches appearing suddenly on the water, of a coast already alerted and armed, was part of the calculation that every man on the leading vessels carried through those hours. The dark that hid them from each other also hid them from anyone watching for them. That at least worked in their favour. William himself, by the account of later chroniclers, reportedly found at one point during the crossing that the fleet had fallen too far behind. The Mora, fastest of the ships, had outpaced the transports, and when a sailor climbed the mast to look back, he could see nothing. No lantern light reflected off sails, no dark shapes following, only open water. The story goes that William ate a meal and drank wine and told his men to be calm, that the fleet was not lost, that the wind and tide were doing their work. That day would reveal what night concealed. Whether this is literally what happened or whether it is the kind of anecdote that accumulates around commanders who win, it captures something true about the crossing. That there were moments in the dark when the plan became invisible, when the entire enterprise contracted to the pitch of a single hull on cold water, and that the men who led it chose in those moments to hold steady. Dawn came slowly, as it does in late September. The light built in the east, grey at first, then silver, and then, as the horizon defined itself, the English coast appeared. Low cliffs, pale against the brightening sky, the beach at Pevensey opening ahead like a sentence completing itself. Behind the Mora, the fleet was there. Not all of it, perhaps not perfectly formed, some ships closer than others, some further behind, but there. The night had not taken them, the shoals had not claimed them, the darkness had not pulled them apart. Nearly 700 ships had followed a single lantern across 20 miles of black water, and most of them had arrived. The crossing was over. What came next was something else entirely. The ships came in fast. There was no harbour at Pevensey, no stone quay, no crane or dock to receive them. What the Norman fleet arrived at on the morning of the 28th of September, 1066, was a wide sheltered bay, shallow water, a gently sloping beach, and, set back from the shore, the enormous ruined walls of a Roman fort that had stood empty for the better part of 2 centuries. The Normans beached their vessels in the oldest way there is. They drove them forward until the hulls ground into sand, and then they got out. That sentence makes it sound simple. It was not. Wace, the 12th century chronicler who drew on oral tradition and earlier accounts for his narrative, gives us the most detailed picture of what the disembarkation actually looked like, and what his description conveys above all else is organised, purposeful chaos. He writes of the whole armada steering to one port, arriving together, casting anchor and running on dry land, crews bearing out shields and saddles and landing the war horses and the palfreys. The sequence matters. Archers went first, scrambling over the sides and wading to shore, forming a loose screen on the beach while the transports were still settling. Then came the knights, the heavy cavalry, the men whose horses had survived the night crossing tethered in the open hulls. The animals were coaxed, pulled, and in some cases simply compelled over the sides into the shallows, and the image of Norman war horses plunging into the surf at Pevensey is one of the most vivid that the entire campaign produces. The bayeux tapestry freezes that image with the directness that only embroidery can achieve. Panel 39, the only surviving contemporary illustration of this moment, carries the Latin caption HST exivent, cabali de navibus. Here the horses leave the ships. It shows riders guiding their mounts down from vessel sides, hooves at the waterline, the beach ahead. There is no drama in the depiction, no grandeur. It looks like work, skilled, dangerous, urgent work, which is exactly what it was. A warhorse is not a creature that takes naturally to surf and sand after a night at sea. Every animal that reached the shore intact represented a piece of the Norman cavalry arm that Harold would eventually have to face, and the men managing those horses in the shallows, steadying them, checking their legs for injury, moving them up the beach and away from the confusion at the water's edge, were performing a task that no chronicle treats as heroic, but that the entire campaign depended on. The transformation those first hours required was almost surreal in its scope. A fleet is not an army. The two things share personnel and equipment, but almost nothing else in the way they function, the way they are commanded, the way they occupy space. Aboard a ship, every man has a fixed position. The vessel's geometry determines his relationship to every other man, and motion is collective and governed by the wind. On a beach, all of that dissolves. 7,000 men and nearly 2,000 horses disgorged across a stretch of sand from several hundred grounded vessels could become a mob inside of 20 minutes without command structures that were clear, enforced, and immediate. The Normans did not become a mob, they became an army. The speed of that transition from sea-borne expedition to organised land force is the real proof of what the crossing had achieved. The Roman fort at the edge of the bay was not incidental to this. William recognised immediately what those ancient walls offered, which was something that could not be improvised in a hostile country: defensible ground. The fort at Pevensey, its walls still substantial despite centuries of abandonment, its enclosure large enough to shelter significant numbers of men and animals, was repaired and garrisoned within hours of the landing. The Normans did not simply arrive and then march inland. They secured a base first. The same instinct that had kept William anchored at Saint-Valery while he waited for the right wind now kept him anchored to this shoreline until the beachhead was hardened. Provisions came ashore. Armour that had been stowed for the crossing was unpacked and donned. A temporary palisade went up. The Roman walls became Norman walls, and the Saxon shore fort that the Romans had built to protect England against sea-borne raiders was repurposed to house the most consequential sea-borne raid the island had ever received. This is the moment that tends to be overlooked in histories of 1066, which typically begin their narrative of the conquest at Hastings. But the conquest begins here, on this beach, in these hours. The battle on the 14th of October was the decisive engagement, yes, but a decisive engagement requires an army that has survived to fight it. That army was assembled, equipped, formed, and given its initial direction at Pevensey, not at Hastings. The shoreline was the proof of concept. If the landing failed, if the disembarkation collapsed into confusion, if the horses were lost, if Harold's forces arrived to find the Normans still half in the water, there would have been no battle to name. The conquest would have ended where it began, in the surf. It did not end there. Within hours the beachhead was organised, and within days William's forces had begun moving east along the Sussex coast toward Hastings, foraging and raiding as they went, the classic strategy of an expeditionary force pressing the local power to respond. The choice of Pevensey itself spoke to this logic. The bay offered shelter, the Roman walls offered a defensible supply point, and the broader Sussex landscape offered roads, settlements, and the kind of agricultural wealth that could feed a campaigning army. The march toward Hastings was not a blunder into unknown territory. It was a calculated provocation, a fist pushed into Sussex designed to pull Harold south before he was ready. But none of that campaign exists without the landing, and the landing exists only because hundreds of shipmasters and thousands of men, and a significant portion of the war horses of Normandy, survived a night crossing in the dark and arrived at a sheltered bay on the English coast in fighting order. Wace, writing with the benefit of decades of retrospect, describes it as though the Armada simply appeared, coherent and purposeful, on the English shore. The reality was that the coherence and the purpose were constructed on that beach, minute by minute, as men waded ashore and animals were led out of the shallows and equipment was stacked and sorted, and the Norman commanders looked at what they had brought across the channel and made an army out of it. The bayou tapestry moves through the landing almost briskly. The horses leave the ships, men carry casks and provisions ashore, the fort appears, the campaign begins. In the embroidered logic of the tapestry, one panel follows another, and the invasion assembles itself with a kind of inevitability that obscures how narrow the margins were at every stage. A different wind, a worse storm, a beach less sheltered, an English fleet still on station in the Channel, Harold moving south a week earlier. Any of these would have produced a different sequence of panels, or no panels at all. What the Norman chroniclers called divine favour, and what we might call the convergence of preparation and luck, held through the night crossing and delivered the fleet to Pevensey intact. The lantern on the moorer had done its work. The tide had been read correctly. The horses had survived. The conquest of England did not begin at the top of Senlac Hill on a bright October morning. It began in the surf at Pevensey, in the grey light of a September dawn, with men and horses spilling out of beached ships onto English sand, and the old Roman walls waiting in the background like a stage set that history had left standing precisely for this purpose. We have been speaking about the tapestry throughout this story, citing it for horses jumping into surf, for lanterns on flagships, for the whole compressed visual grammar of the invasion, and it is time to look at it directly and honestly, because the bayou tapestry is not simply a piece of evidence. It is an argument. It was made by the victors, probably commissioned by Odo of Bayeux, William's half-brother, in the years immediately following the conquest, and almost certainly stitched by English hands. Embroiderers, quite possibly from Canterbury, or a similar centre of Anglo-Saxon needlework tradition, who were skilled enough to work in wool on linen with extraordinary fluency. The people who created it were not neutral observers recording events for posterity. They were producing a document that served a political purpose, one that told the story of 1066 in a way that justified Norman rule, legitimised William's claim, and placed Harold's resistance in the frame of usurpation and broken oath. When you look at the tapestry, you are looking at the 11th century's version of a state-sponsored narrative. That does not make it worthless. It makes it complicated, and complication is exactly the right relationship to have with a source this rich. Panel 39 is where the naval history lives. The scene depicts the Norman fleet in preparation and transit, ships in varying stages of loading, men hauling armour and provisions down to the water's edge, and then the vessels themselves, underway or beached, with horses being transferred between ship and shore. The Latin caption at the relevant point reads, Hic exevent cabali de navives. Here the horses leave the ships, and the embroidered horses are shown in the direct and economical way the tapestry handles most things, stepping or leaping from the sides of vessels into shallow water, guided by men wading at their bridles. It looks abrupt. It probably was. What the hull shapes tell us is limited, but not nothing. The ships in panel 39 are rendered with the characteristic Norman overlapping straight construction, clinker-built hulls with the familiar high curved stems and sterns of the Norse tradition from which Norman shipbuilding descended. They are not warships in the aggressive sense. They are transport vessels, and the tapestry seems to grasp this distinction. William's flagship, identifiable by context and prominent treatment, carries a more complex rigging arrangement than the others. Scholars who have studied the panel closely have counted up to 6 shrouds and stays on that single vessel, while the surrounding ships show only 2 to 4 supporting ropes. That asymmetry is not accidental decoration. It suggests a real hierarchy of vessel types within the fleet. A larger, better-rigged flagship surrounded by smaller, more simply rigged transport ships, exactly the mixed composition that you would expect from a fleet assembled in months across the ports of Normandy. The oar holes are worth dwelling on. Some ships in the panel show what appear to be up to 18 oar holes along a single hull, which would indicate a relatively shallow oared craft capable of beach landings without harbour infrastructure. This matters enormously for understanding how the horses were disembarked at Pevensey. If the cavalry transports were oared vessels of relatively shallow draught, they could be brought close inshore, or actually grounded, allowing horses to step or leap into manageable depths of water rather than being lowered by crane or ramp from a high-sided vessel. The tapestry appears to show exactly this. Ships poled through the shallows, horses going over the gunwale in what looks like a short, sharp drop into water, no deeper than a horse's chest. It is a practical solution to a logistical problem, and the fact that the tapestry illustrates it rather than eliding it suggests the embroiderers had either seen such operations or been briefed by people who had. The shields are another small revelation. They are shown mounted inside the hull along the gunwales rather than displayed on the outside of the vessel, which was the ceremonial arrangement familiar from Viking Age imagery, and from the tapestry's own earlier scenes of ships at rest. On a transport laden with horses, armour, provisions and men, hanging your shields on the outside would have been absurd. They would catch spray, collect damage, and put weight in the wrong place. Mounting them inside along the upper strakes is the practical solution, and the tapestry shows the practical solution. This is a small thing, but small things are what careful sources do, and it nudges the panel slightly closer to documentary reliability on points of material detail, even while we remain appropriately sceptical of its broader narrative claims. And yet the caution must be maintained. The hulls in panel 39 are stylized. They are not ship plans. The proportions are compressed for visual clarity. A vessel that would actually have been 60 or 70 feet long is shown in a space that suggests something much smaller, because the embroiderers were designing a readable image within a fixed band of linen, not producing a technical drawing for a shipwright. The rigging details, while suggestive, cannot be treated as precise records of standing or running rigging arrangements. The sail shapes vary from panel to panel in ways that probably reflect artistic convention more than actual variation in sailcloth. When scholars at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde have used the tapestry as a reference for reconstructing 11th century vessel types, they have done so carefully, using the imagery as one data point among many, not as a primary specification. That is the correct approach. The tapestry shows us the vocabulary of the ships. It cannot tell us the grammar. What it can do, what nothing else surviving from 1066 can do, is place us in the middle of the logistics. The loading scenes in panel 39 are extraordinary, not because they are technically precise, but because they are interested. They show the work, barrels being rolled down to the water, hauled into waiting ships, armour being carried on men's backs, horses led by their bridles toward vessels that they would have no natural inclination to board. The tapestry does not linger on the heroism of the crossing. It shows the labour of the crossing, and labour is something that chronicles, which are written by men with an interest in glory, tend to skip over. The people who stitched panel 39 gave us something the chroniclers chose not to: the granular texture of an army going afloat. This is where the tapestry's dual nature becomes most interesting. As a narrative, it serves Norman power. As a visual document, it preserves the memory of work that Norman power depended on, but had no ideological reason to celebrate. The knights and the commanders get the glory in the chronicle tradition, the sailors who rigged the ships, the grooms who managed horses in the surf, the men who rolled barrels in the dark and loaded provisions by torchlight. They appear in the embroidery because the embroiderers understood, perhaps from proximity to such work, that without those people the crossing does not happen. Panel 39 is inadvertently democratic in a way that the text sources never are. Historians will always return to it. Not because it resolves the uncertainties, the exact dimensions of the ships, the precise loading technique, the actual rigging configurations, but because it refuses to let those uncertainties become abstractions. Every question we have about how William got his army across the Channel has a visual anchor in this one-stitched scene. The hull in the water, the horse at the gunwale, the man in the shallows holding the bridle, knee-deep in the surf, looking toward shore. That figure appears for only a moment in the embroidery, in a strip of linen barely a foot wide, made by hands that may have belonged to an English craftsperson whose world had just been permanently altered by the man whose fleet they were now depicting. The tapestry contains that irony without acknowledging it. The conquest it celebrates was carried across the Channel in ships that looked like these, and the proof that they looked like these is preserved in the work of the people it conquered. There is no cleaner illustration of why history so rarely travels in straight lines. So we have the tapestry, we have the chronicles, we have the wind records and the tide tables and the dendrochronological studies and the meteorological reconstructions. What we do not have, what no diver has ever pulled from the sediment of the English Channel, what no harbour excavation has yet turned up, what no coastal survey has definitively identified, is a single ship from William's fleet. Think about what that means for a moment. One of the most consequential military operations in the history of the medieval world, an armada that contemporary sources numbered at somewhere between 700 and 3,000 vessels, depending on which chronicler you trust and how generously you interpret their arithmetic. A crossing that carried an army of over 7,000 men and up to 2,000 horses across open water in the autumn of 1066 reshaped the political landscape of England permanently and generated more documentation, chronicles, tapestries, administrative records than almost any other single event of the 11th century. And the ships themselves have simply vanished. The absence is striking enough that it has its own kind of presence in the scholarly literature. Researchers who study the archaeology of medieval seafaring note, almost as a matter of settled fact, that there is no record of any of the conqueror's ships being wrecked on the crossing itself, and that none of the vessels which survived the journey and returned to Normandy can be identified in the archaeological record either. They are gone, all of them. Several hundred wooden hulls that once floated across 22 miles of water, and not one can be pointed to and named. The reasons are both mundane and quietly fascinating, and they tell us as much about the Channel as they do about the 11th century. Wood is patient, but not permanent. A ship hull abandoned in open water or on an exposed beach begins to break down almost immediately. The teredos, the shipworm, that slow destroyer of maritime history, works through unprotected oak planking with an efficiency that archaeologists find infuriating. Storm action grinds and scatters the tidal streams of the English Channel, which run with considerable force across shifting sandbanks and are driven into complex patterns by the bottleneck between the North Sea and the Atlantic, do not preserve things gently. They move them, abrade them, bury them briefly, and then uncover them again. Survival requires a particular coincidence of conditions: rapid burial under anaerobic sediment, stable seabed chemistry, and the simple luck of never being disturbed by later dredging, anchoring, or trawling. In the Channel approaches, that combination rarely holds for 950 years, but the sea alone cannot account for the completeness of the disappearance. The other force at work is human, and it was at least as thorough as the tides. Medieval ship timber was not waste material. It was a resource, and it was treated as one. Oak planking cut and shaped for a ship's hull represented skilled labour and high-quality wood, exactly the kind of material that communities along the Norman and English coasts would have salvaged as a matter of practical economy. When a vessel was retired, damaged, or rendered surplus, its timber went somewhere useful, into buildings, into harbour structures, into the repair of other vessels. The evidence for this is not theoretical. Archaeologists working at Westminster in the 1990s identified oak planks in medieval construction contexts and determined through detailed analysis that they were reused ship planking, their original fastening holes and characteristic clinker-work surfaces still visible. The ships had been disassembled and incorporated into the built environment. They had not been lost. They had been repurposed into invisibility. This was standard practice, not exception, and it means that William's fleet, which by most accounts returned to Normandy after the landing at Pevensey, the transport vessels had no further military role once the army was ashore, would have been distributed back into the port economies of the Norman coast over the following years and decades. The ships that carried the conquest dissolved, plank by plank into the infrastructure of the society the conquest had just transformed. The handful of 11th century ship-related finds that archaeology has managed to recover illustrate the scale of this absence rather than filling it. Excavations in the Thames at Billingsgate and at a Southwark site have turned up waterlogged oak timbers and planking fragments that dendrochronological dating places in the early 11th century, the general period of the Conquest, or shortly before it. These fragments tell us that ships of this period existed, that they were built in the clinker tradition the tapestry depicts, and that they occasionally ended up preserved by the particular conditions of the Thames foreshore. But they cannot be connected to any named vessel or specific event. They are anonymous fragments of the maritime world that produced William's fleet, not the fleet itself. The gap between what they show and what we want to know is essentially unbridgeable. The first shipwrecks that historians can match with reasonable confidence to specific documentary events appear only in the mid-15th century, some 400 years after the Conquest. Before that, the record is almost entirely inferential. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions the loss of Harold Hardrada's ships after Stamford Bridge, scattered by the retreating Norwegian forces, but even that narrative leaves no identifiable wreck. The physical and the documentary records simply do not converge for this period, and the English Channel in autumn 1066 is one of the most eloquent examples of why. What survives then is shadow evidence, absence shaped into meaning. When historians and maritime archaeologists describe the crossing now, they are doing something genuinely unusual. They are reconstructing an event at sea almost entirely from sources that are not the sea. The bayeux tapestry shows us hull forms and loading methods. The chronicles give us wind directions, rough timings, and some indication of scale. Modern climatological modelling of medieval weather patterns allows researchers to reconstruct the probable conditions of late September 1066 with some confidence. Tidal calculations can tell us when the streams in the channel would have been running in the right direction for a crossing from Saint-Valery. All of these feed into a picture that is coherent, internally consistent, and supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. But the ships themselves are not there. The physical objects around which all this interpretation circulates have not been found. There is something genuinely strange about that, about narrating a naval event of this magnitude while standing, metaphorically, in front of an empty display case. It is the historical equivalent of reconstructing the entire grammar of a language without a single surviving text written in it. You can do it with enough indirect evidence, but the absence of the primary material shapes every inference you make, whether you acknowledge it openly or not, and the channel keeps its own counsel. It is a busy, heavily surveyed body of water, one of the most intensively studied stretches of sea on Earth, precisely because so much has happened in and around it. Divers work those waters regularly, survey vessels cross and recross the same ground. The seabed along the Normandy coast and the Sussex approaches has been examined in detail for reasons that have nothing to do with 1066. If there were intact Norman hulls down there in recoverable condition, the odds of their remaining undiscovered for this long would be extremely low, which suggests, fairly firmly, that there are none, that the fleet which crossed in the dark of September 1066, the lanterns swaying on the flagship's masthead, the horses pressed together in the transport holds, the oarsmen pulling through the channel swell, was consumed, in one way or another, by the century that followed it. Some by the sea, most by the pragmatic hands of people who understood that a retired hull was a supply of good timber. The ghosts of the channel are not at the bottom of it. They are in the walls of houses that no longer stand, in harbour piles long since rotted, in the grain of furniture and beams that burned in fires we cannot date. The fleet that changed England did not sink dramatically or lie waiting for discovery. It simply became part of everything else, and left us to find it the only way we can, by looking very carefully at the space where it used to be. So where does that leave us exactly? With shadow evidence, as we have just seen, with the empty display case, the absence shaped into meaning. But absence is not the same as ignorance, and this is perhaps the most important distinction to hold on to when thinking about the Channel crossing of 1066. Historians have been working this problem for centuries, and the tools they use have grown considerably more sophisticated than anything available to the first people who tried to make sense of what William actually did in the autumn of that year. The reconstruction begins with the chronicles, because they are the only contemporary voices we have. William of Poitiers, writing within a decade of the events he describes, gives us the closest thing to an eyewitness narrative of the storm and the crossing in his Gesta Guglielmi. He traces the wind's movement with a precision that reads almost like a ship's log, a southwest wind that initially blew the fleet out of Dives-sur-Mer, then a shift to the west that drove the transports along the Norman coast rather than across it, and finally a turn to the northwest that pushed them towards Saint-Valery. That sequence of directions is not a vague dramatic flourish. It is a specific meteorological claim, and for 9 centuries it sat there in the text as narrative rather than data. Then, in 1986, the meteorologist J. Newman approached it differently. Newman's analysis, published by the Royal Meteorological Society, reconstructed the atmospheric conditions over the English Channel in late September 1066 by modelling what kind of pressure system would produce exactly the wind-veering pattern William of Poitiers described. The answer was coherent and plausible. A high-pressure system sitting over northern England combined with an Atlantic low-moving eastward would generate precisely that sequence. Southwest, then west, then northwest, as the low tracked across the region. The chronicler's account, in other words, passed a meteorological test it was never designed for. That convergence between medieval testimony and modern atmospheric modelling is one of the more striking moments in the historiography of 1066, and it gives historians a meaningful degree of confidence that the storm narrative reflects something real rather than something invented for dramatic effect. But confidence in the broad outline does not resolve the detailed questions, and here the responsible scholar must slow down and be honest about what the evidence actually supports. Take fleet size. The ship lists associated with the assembly at Dives-sur-Mer record approximately 777 vessels. Master Wace, writing in the 12th century and drawing on sources that may include oral tradition as well as earlier texts, gives a figure of roughly 694 ships departing from Saint-Valery, implying a loss of around 83 vessels in the storm, somewhere in the region of 10% of the fleet. Those numbers have a specificity that feels authoritative. Yet other sources, less constrained by arithmetic precision, speak of 3,000 ships, a figure so inflated that it says more about the rhetorical culture of medieval chronicle writing than about anything William actually launched. The historian's job is to weigh these figures against each other, against the logistical realities of 11th century shipbuilding, against the capacity of Norman ports, and arrive at a figure that is defensible rather than merely dramatic. The 777 and 694 numbers survive that scrutiny better than the round thousands do, but even they carry uncertainty, because the manuscripts in which they appear are copies of copies, and numbers are among the most corruption-prone elements in any scribal tradition. The bayeux tapestry enters this process as an entirely different kind of evidence. It is not narrative, it is not arithmetic, it is visual testimony, created within living memory of the crossing by hands that were either present in Normandy at the time or in close contact with people who were. Panel 39 is the section that matters most for the maritime reconstruction. The fleet in motion, the horses visible, figures leaping from ships in what appears to depict the disembarkation at Pevensey. The hull forms shown in the tapestry are consistent with the clinker-built construction tradition that the Billingsgate and Southwark fragments confirm was in use during this period. The depiction of horses being unloaded over the sides of vessels, rather than through purpose-built ramps or stern doors, tells us something specific and unglamorous about how the cavalry was managed, and it matches what we might expect from ships adapted for this purpose, rather than designed for it from the keel up. The tapestry is, however, an embroidery, not a technical drawing. Its creators were not naval architects. The ships are stylized, the proportions are interpretive, and the details of rigging and deck arrangement cannot be read as precise specifications. This is the kind of distinction that separates plausible inference from documented fact. We can say, the tapestry shows clinker-built vessels with single square sails, steering oars rather than rudders, and an open-hold arrangement consistent with carrying both men and horses. We cannot say, the tapestry tells us the exact beam-to-length ratio of a Norman transport, or the precise method by which the horses were secured during the crossing. The image confirms the broad picture. It does not resolve the technical details. What this means, when you assemble all the sources together, is that the crossing of 1066 occupies a genuinely unusual position in medieval historiography. It is, in some respects, one of the best documented naval operations of its century. The chronicle coverage is richer than for almost any comparable event. The bayeux tapestry provides visual evidence that simply does not exist for other 11th century military crossings. The meteorological reconstruction is more detailed and independently validated than anything we can produce for, say, Harold Hardrada's crossing from Norway earlier that same year. And yet, and this is the paradox that the missing wrecks make unavoidable, there are fundamental questions about the crossing that cannot be answered with confidence. Exactly how many ships made it to Pevensey? How many men and horses were lost in the storm, not just the vessels? How were the ships organised during the crossing itself, in convoy, in discrete squadrons, in a loose formation guided by the flagship's lantern? The evidence points toward answers but does not deliver them. This uncertainty does not diminish the crossing. If anything, it clarifies its significance. The more carefully you examine what William achieved in the logistics of that operation, assembling a fleet capable of moving over 7,000 men and up to 2,000 horses across the Channel in autumn conditions, surviving a storm that destroyed roughly 80 to 90 ships, regrouping at Saint-Valery and waiting with an army poised for weeks until the wind turned favourable, then executing a night crossing timed to the tides, the more apparent it becomes that what happened at sea was not a prelude to the conquest. It was the conquest's first and most demanding act. Without the crossing, there is no Hastings. Without the planning, the construction, the navigation, and the extraordinary management of the storm's aftermath, Harold Godwinson never faces a Norman army on English soil. The battle that history remembers was made possible by a naval operation that history has only partially preserved, and perhaps that is fitting. Memory tends to fasten on the dramatic and the decisive, the shield wall, the arrow, the collapse of the English line. The ships that made all of it possible are harder to hold in the imagination, harder to picture, and now literally impossible to find. But the historians who have spent decades working through the chronicles, modelling the medieval weather, studying the tapestry's panels with magnifying glasses, and diving through the Channel's murky water, looking for hull timbers that are not there. They have built something real from the fragments available to them, not certainty, but a coherent, honest, carefully qualified account of how one man moved an army across the sea and changed the course of a nation in the dark in September 950 years ago. That kind of reconstruction is itself a form of navigation, reading the evidence the way William's pilots read the sky, working with what can be known, keeping close counsel about what cannot, and trusting that the crossing, made carefully enough, will hold. There is a temptation, when telling the story of 1066, to begin at Hastings and work backward, to treat the battle as the event that everything else explains. But spend long enough with the evidence of the crossing, and that temptation dissolves. By the time William's cavalry rode out onto the Sussex Downs on the morning of October 14th, the hardest and most consequential work was already behind him. The conquest had been won, in the most meaningful sense, on the water. Consider what it actually required. A fleet of roughly 770 vessels had to be assembled from scratch in less than a year at ports along the Norman coast. Over 7,000 men and something approaching 2,000 horses had to be loaded onto ships that were not purpose-built for the task, provisioned for a campaign of unknown length, and kept ready for departure across weeks of waiting while the wind refused to cooperate. When a storm finally struck in early September, scattering the fleet along the Alabaster coast and destroying somewhere between 80 and 90 ships, William had to absorb that loss, conceal its full human cost from the men who remained, regroup at Saint-Valery, and hold his army together through weeks more of delay without allowing discipline or morale to fracture beyond recovery. Then, when the wind finally turned, he had to execute a night crossing of the English Channel timed to the tides, navigate without instruments in darkness, and bring a force of that size to shore at Pevensey in a condition fit to fight. Every one of those steps had to succeed. The failure of any single one would have ended the invasion before Harold ever had to raise his standard. What makes this more remarkable, not less, is how much of it was improvised under pressure. The ships were built quickly, many of them adapted merchantmen and fishing vessels pressed into military service. The horse transport problem had no established solution. The bayeux tapestry's famous image of animals jumping over the sides of vessels into shallow water is not a scene of elegant logistics. It is a scene of controlled improvisation, men and animals working through a problem for which there was no manual. The tidal timing of the crossing drew on the accumulated knowledge of Norman sailors and pilots who understood the channel's rhythms, but even that knowledge could not guarantee a calm night or a clean landfall. The protected bay at Pevensey gave the invasion its foothold on English soil, but reaching it required everything else to have gone right first. The sea, in other words, was not the backdrop to this story. It was the first battlefield, and in many ways the most demanding one. Hastings lasted a single day. The maritime phase of the conquest lasted months, and it extracted a price, in drowned men buried secretly at Saint-Valery, in wrecked ships driven onto the Norman shore, in the accumulated strain of an army held under arms and waiting, that the chronicles only partially acknowledge and the physical record does not acknowledge at all. The Channel swallowed its evidence. No confirmed wreck of the conquest fleet has ever been found. The timbers are gone, the rigging is gone, the bones of the men lost in the storm are gone. What the sea took, it has kept. That absence is part of the story too, and it connects the events of 1066 to questions that historians, archaeologists and maritime scientists are still actively working through. Modern weather modelling can reconstruct the pressure systems that produced William of Poitiers' wind sequence, with a confidence that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. Underwater surveys continue to probe the Channel floor, not with any expectation of finding the fleet intact, but in the hope that something, a timber, an anchor, a fragment of clinker planking, might one day surface from the silt and add one more data point to the reconstruction. The fascination endures because the stakes were so high and the evidence is so partial. A crossing that changed the language, the law, the architecture, and the genetic profile of an entire nation left almost no physical trace in the water it crossed. And that fragility is perhaps the most important thing to carry away from the whole story. The Norman invasion was, by the standards of its time, a logistical achievement of the first order. Carefully planned, resourcefully adapted to setbacks, precisely timed. But it was also, at every stage, contingent. A different wind on a different night. A storm that arrived a few weeks later. A tide line that didn't match the calculation. Any of these things, and the army that changed England never reaches the shore. The Channel did not simply separate two kingdoms in 1066. It tested the invasion at every point of the crossing, demanded everything William had in preparation and nerve, and only then allowed the conquest to begin. Before Hastings there was the sea, and the sea made everything possible, and could just as easily have made it impossible.